The heavy, silver-embossed box arrived at precisely 10 a.m. on the morning of our 10th wedding anniversary, draped in a ribbon the color of dried blood and smelling faintly of expensive jasmine and cold ozone. I had spent the morning in a state of carefully curated nostalgia, wearing the vintage silk robe Mark had bought me in Florence, and sipping the specific blend of Earl Grey we had shared on our honeymoon, fully expecting the delivery to be the diamond tennis bracelet he had dropped heavy hints about during our candlelit dinner at La Valaris the night before. However, the moment my fingers brushed the heavy, cream-colored card attached to the lid, a strange electric chill shot up my spine. The card wasn't addressed to Amanda, the name he had whispered into my hair for a decade, but to a woman named Elena, written in a frantic, elegant script that looked hauntingly like my husband's private shorthand. My breath hitched in the hollow of my throat as I retreated into the sterile, sun-drenched sanctuary of our minimalist kitchen, the silence of the house suddenly feeling predatory and vast. I pulled the ribbon, and instead of the expected velvet jewelry case, I found a leather-bound journal, its cover worn at the edges and smelling of old tobacco and salt air, as if it had traveled across oceans and through hidden lives. I opened the first page, expecting a mistake or a cruel prank, but my heart plummeted into my stomach as I recognized Mark's meticulous, architectural handwriting filling every line with a cold, chronological precision that felt like a surgical autopsy of our entire relationship. The first entry was dated July 14th, the day of our wedding, and it didn't speak of love or devotion, but of a successful deployment of the primary cover identity, followed by a list of psychological triggers he had used to ensure I would never question his frequent overnight consulting trips to Geneva. The journal wasn't a diary of emotions, but a logistical ledger of deception, a meticulous record of every lie, every fabricated late night at the office, and every carefully staged coincidence that had kept me blinded to his true nature for 3,650 days. As I turned the pages, the sheer scale of the betrayal began to vibrate through my bones. He had logged the exact temperature of the wine he served me on the nights I felt suspicious, knowing that a specific level of intoxication and comfort would dull my analytical edge. He recorded the names of the actors he had hired to play colleagues at our holiday parties, the cost of the fake emergency phone calls that pulled him away from my father's funeral, and the specific coordinates of a secondary home in the Alps where Elena was waiting for him, while I sat alone in our bed, texting him that I missed him. By the time I reached the 5th paragraph of the 2nd chapter, the room seemed to tilt on its axis, the familiar luxury of my home dissolving into a theatrical set designed by a man who viewed me as a mission objective rather than a wife. He had even documented my predictable reactions to his gaslighting, noting the exact moments I would apologize for my paranoia and the specific gifts, the pearls, the flowers, the weekend getaways, that acted as the most effective reset buttons for my growing unease. I realized with a sickening clarity that our entire domestic life was a series of tactical maneuvers, the way he kissed the back of my neck while I cooked, the way he remembered my favorite obscure poets, and even the way he held me during my miscarriages were all listed as empathy simulations designed to maintain the structural integrity of his Amanda project. The entry from 3 years ago, during the month I thought we were closest, described a near-catastrophic breach of protocol when I found a burner phone in his gym bag, and the journal detailed how he had spent 12 hours planting evidence to frame our housekeeper for the theft. He wrote about the pleasure of watching me fire her, noting that my guilt over the incident made me even more vulnerable and dependent on his unwavering support, effectively turning my own morality into a weapon against me. I looked at the photos on the mantel, the two of us in Santorini, laughing against a backdrop of blue water, and saw them for what they were, staged propaganda for a life that only existed in the curated spaces between his true operations. Every smile in those pictures was a calculated lie, a performance for an audience of one, designed to keep me in a state of blissful, profitable ignorance while he moved assets through shell companies I didn't know existed. The journal revealed that the mysterious gift I was currently holding was actually intended for Elena as a final transition dossier, a manual for her to take over the next phase of his life once my utilization period was terminated. According to the timeline, today wasn't just our 10th anniversary, it was the scheduled dissolution date, the day he had planned to disappear from my life forever, leaving behind a trail of fabricated debt and a staged suicide that would keep the authorities from looking for him. The leather in my hands felt like dead skin, the weight of the book a physical manifestation of a decade of stolen time, and I realized that the delivery man hadn't made a mistake. Someone, perhaps a disgruntled associate or a rival in his shadow world, had redirected this package to me as a final scorched earth act of revenge. I heard the heavy thud of Mark's SUV pulling into the gravel driveway, the sound echoing through the house like a rhythmic countdown to a confrontation I was nowhere near prepared for. According to the journal, he would enter the house with a bouquet of yellow roses, my favorite because he had conditioned me to love them, and he would suggest a glass of champagne before he disappeared to the study to finalize the paperwork of my ruin. I stood in the center of the kitchen, the sun mocking me with its brightness, and felt a cold, sharp blade of resolve crystallize in my chest. If I was a mission objective, then it was time to change the parameters of the engagement. He thought he was coming home to a broken woman he had successfully dismantled over 10 years, but he was actually walking into the path of a survivor who had just been handed the master key to his own destruction. I didn't hide the journal. Instead, I placed it prominently on the marble island, open to the page where he had calculated the exact value of my life insurance policy in the event of my unfortunate accident. I moved toward the wine cellar, my heart beating with the slow, heavy thud of a war drum, and selected the most expensive vintage we owned, knowing it was the one he had planned to toast my departure with. As the front door's smart lock let out its familiar melodic chime, I felt the Amanda persona fall away like a discarded mask, leaving behind a woman who was no longer interested in love, but in the cold logistical application of justice. He called out my name, the Amanda he had invented, his voice warm and rich with a decade of practiced affection, and I felt a surge of adrenaline that was cleaner and more powerful than any emotion I had ever felt in his arms. He rounded the corner, the yellow roses vibrant against his charcoal suit, but he stopped dead as his eyes landed on the leather-bound book sitting in the light, the silence in the room suddenly sharpening into a jagged, dangerous edge. The simulation faltered for a fraction of a second, his polished exterior cracking just enough for me to see the predatory calculation beneath. As he realized the Elena dossier was in the hands of the wrong woman, he didn't rush toward me or offer an apology. He dropped the flowers on the floor and stood perfectly still, his body language shifting from loving husband to cornered operative with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency. "Amanda," he began, his voice dropping an octave into a tone I had never heard before. Flat, devoid of warmth, and utterly lethal. "We need to discuss the administrative error that brought that book into this house." I didn't scream, and I didn't cry. I simply picked up the kitchen knife I had been using to cut the anniversary cake and held it with a steady, practiced grip that seemed to surprise even him. "The error wasn't the delivery, Mark," I said, my voice echoing with a coldness that matched the ink on the pages. "The error was thinking that 10 years of your simulations wouldn't eventually teach me exactly how to anticipate your next move." I watched his eyes scan the room, looking for his own burner phones, his hidden weapons, and the exit strategies he had meticulously logged in the journal, only to see the small, blinking red lights of the security system I had just reprogrammed to lock the house down. He was no longer the architect of this reality. He was a guest in a trap I had inherited the blueprints for, and for the first time in a decade, the logistics of the house were entirely under my control. The journal had mentioned a contingency for discovery on page 84, a protocol that involved him using a concealed sedative he kept in his watch, but I had already replaced the contents with a harmless, saline solution while he was in the shower that morning. I had been suspicious for longer than he realized, I just hadn't had the proof until today. As he reached for the watch, a small, arrogant smirk played across his lips, the habit of dominance dying hard even in the face of total exposure, but his expression turned to pure, unadulterated shock when the needle clicked against his skin and nothing happened. I realized then that the man who had spent 10 years mapping my mind had completely failed to account for the one variable he couldn't control, the sheer incandescent rage of a woman who has nothing left to lose. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 3,000 lies, the air in the kitchen thick with the smell of the crushed roses and the metallic tang of the knife in my hand. He took a step back, his eyes darting toward the heavy mahogany doors of the study, but I knew he wouldn't find his emergency getaway kit there, because I had already moved it to the trunk of my car an hour ago. Every safe word, every panic button, and every ghost account he had built as a safety net was now a string in my hand, and I was beginning to pull them all until his entire world unraveled. "You spent 10 years writing about me," I whispered, the words feeling like a physical weight in the air. But you never actually bothered to look at me, did you? I began to read aloud from the journal, my voice steady and clinical, reciting the exact dollar amount he had stolen from my grandmother's trust fund to pay for Elena's villa in Lake Como, watching his face drain of color as the audit of his life began. Every word I spoke was a nail in the coffin of his freedom, a verbal record of the crimes he had documented with such pride, thinking no one would ever have the intellect to decode them. I saw the moment he realized that I wasn't going to call the police, at least not yet, because I wanted him to experience the same psychological dismantling he had inflicted on me for a decade. I wanted him to feel the walls of his own project closing in, to see his meticulously constructed life dissolve into a series of errors and failures that he couldn't optimize his way out of. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that I could almost see the digital ghost of his authority flickering and dying, replaced by the raw, analog reality of my presence. He tried to speak, to launch into another empathy simulation about how he did it all for us. But the words died in his throat as I flipped to the page where he had mocked my grief over the third miscarriage, calling it a necessary emotional catalyst for deepened dependency. In that moment, the man I had loved was officially dead, replaced by a biological machine that needed to be dismantled, with the same cold precision he had used on me. I realized that our 10th anniversary wasn't a celebration of a marriage, but the inauguration of a war, and I was the one holding the map to his every weakness. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long predatory shadows across the kitchen floor, I closed the journal with a final echoing thud and looked him dead in the eye. "You have exactly 10 minutes to tell me where the rest of the Project Elena files are kept," I said, my voice as sharp and unforgiving as the silver ribbon on the box, or I start hitting the send button on the automated email I've prepared for every one of your colleagues in Geneva. The master of lies stood before me, stripped of his scripts and his staged coincidences, finally forced to face the one person he had never been able to truly script, the woman who was no longer his wife but his judge. The 10 minutes passed in a silence so thick it felt like drowning, the only sound being the rhythmic ticking of the designer clock Mark had given me for our 5th anniversary, a device I now knew contained a hidden microphone that had been feeding my private conversations to his Project Vulcan servers. He sat across from me at the marble island, his hands trembling slightly, a glitch in his normally flawless physical composure, as he realized that the utilization period he had planned for me hadn't ended in my destruction, but in his own catastrophic exposure. I watched him try to formulate a countermove, his eyes flicking toward the kitchen's smart hub, but I had already cut the external feed, isolating him in this house just as he had isolated me within our marriage for the last decade. He finally broke, his voice a dry rasp as he surrendered the decryption keys to the Lake Como servers, his pride as an operative finally collapsing under the weight of his own documented crimes. With the keys in my possession, I felt a surge of cold, analytical power that I had never known I possessed, a dormant part of my psyche waking up to the reality that I was actually better at his game than he was. I opened my laptop and began the digital raid, watching as the screens filled with the hidden architecture of his second life, a sprawling network of offshore accounts, fake identities, and high-resolution surveillance footage of a woman who looked hauntingly, like a younger, more naive version of myself. Elena wasn't just a mistress, she was the next iteration, a woman being groomed in a villa funded by my inheritance, being fed the same lies and subjected to the same empathy simulations that had kept me captive for 10 years. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He wasn't just cheating, he was running a repeatable experiment in human manipulation, and I was simply the prototype that was being decommissioned to make room for the upgrade. I navigated through the folders with a surgeon's precision, bypassing the decoy files he had set up to trap anyone who stumbled upon his secrets, until I found the final phase document, which outlined the staged car accident planned for me tomorrow evening. My hands didn't shake as I read the logistics of my own death, the calculated speed of the impact, the pre-written eulogy he had already saved in his drafts, and the list of grief-stricken performances he was scheduled to give at my funeral. Seeing the blueprint for my murder written in the same hand that had held mine during my father's illness stripped away the last vestige of my humanity, leaving only a cold, vibrating core of vengeance. I looked up at him, and for the first time he looked truly afraid, seeing that the Amanda he had invented was officially gone, replaced by a woman who was now the primary threat to his survival. The dismantling began with a single keystroke, as I initiated a burn protocol on his primary bank accounts, rerouting the funds he had stolen from my family back into a series of untraceable crypto wallets I had set up in the last hour. I watched his face as he received the alerts on his watch, the color draining from his skin as he realized his financial lifeblood, the millions he had hoarded to fund his escape with Elena, was evaporating into the digital ether. He lunged across the table, a desperate, animalistic snarl escaping his lips, but I simply stepped back and pressed the button on the security remote, activating the high-frequency alarm that signaled a breach to his own private security contractors. I knew their protocol. They would arrive in 6 minutes, and if they found him in a compromised position with a hostile asset, their orders were to treat him as a liability to be neutralized, not a client to be saved. He froze, the sound of the distant sirens already beginning to wail like banshees through the quiet, affluent neighborhood, and he realized I had turned his own extraction team into his executioners. He tried to bargain then, offering me the locations of hidden safety deposit boxes filled with diamonds and gold, his voice a pathetic whine that made me sick to my stomach for ever having loved him. I ignored his pleas, my focus entirely on the Elena dossier, where I found her contact information and a live feed of the Lake Como Villa. She was sitting on a terrace, looking out at the water, wearing the exact same silk robe I was wearing right now. I initiated a secure video call to her device, and when her face appeared on my screen, full of confusion and a faint, familiar hope, I held the journal up to the camera so she could see the dossier for herself. I didn't say a word as I flipped through the pages for her, showing her the grooming logs and the transition dates, watching her expression shift from curiosity to a horrifying, soul-crushing realization that matched my own from hours ago. Mark watched the screen in silent agony as his next iteration saw the man behind the mask, his two lives colliding in a digital explosion that destroyed his past and his future in a single moment. Elena didn't scream. She simply closed her eyes and disconnected the call, and I knew from the final transition logs that she would be gone from that villa within the hour, taking the remaining evidence with her. Mark slumped back into his chair, a broken shell of a man who had built a kingdom on a foundation of air, only to watch it blow away in the wind of his own hubris. The security team's SUVs screeched onto our gravel driveway, their headlights cutting through the twilight like searchlights in a prison yard, and I knew my time with him was drawing to a close. I leaned in close to his ear, the smell of his expensive cologne now smelling like rot and decay, and whispered the one thing I knew would haunt him more than the loss of his money or his mistress. "In your journal, you wrote that I was a predictable variable," I said, my voice a low, terrifying hum, "but you forgot that even. The best simulations fail when the subject realizes they're in a cage." I stood up and walked toward the back exit, the journal tucked firmly under my arm, leaving him to face the cleanup crew he had hired to protect his lies, knowing they wouldn't be merciful to a man who had lost his leverage. As I stepped out into the cool night air, the sounds of the front door being breached echoing through the house, I felt a strange, hollow sense of peace, the kind that only comes after a total and absolute destruction. I walked to my car, the one he had gifted me for our 8th anniversary, now fully scrubbed of its tracking devices, and started the engine, the roar of the machine feeling like a primal scream for my own rebirth. I looked back at the house one last time, the glowing windows reflecting a decade of a life that never truly existed, a beautiful, expensive tomb for a woman who was finally, officially dead. I put the car in gear and drove away, the journal sitting on the passenger seat like a map to a new world where I would never again be anyone's mission objective or predictable variable. The road ahead was dark and unfamiliar, stretching out toward a horizon that held no scripts, no simulations, and no lies, and for the first time in 10 years, I didn't know where I was going, and it was the most beautiful feeling in the world. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the burner phone I had taken from Mark's study, the one he used for direct CEO contact, and I sent a single text message to the encrypted number at the top of the list. "Project Vulcan has been compromised. The auditor is coming for you next," I wrote, hitting send before tossing the phone out the window and into the deep, dark woods bordering the highway. I wasn't just surviving a cheating husband, I was dismantling a global network of shadow operatives, and I was going to use every trick he had taught me to burn their world to the ground. By the time I reached the city limits, the news alerts were already starting to pop up on the radio, reporting a suspicious fire at a prominent tech CEO's estate and a series of unexplained glitches in international banking systems. I pulled into a nondescript, 24-hour diner, the kind of place Mark would have never stepped foot in, and ordered a black coffee, the bitter heat of it grounding me in the reality of my new life. I opened the journal to the very last page, a blank space he had intended for the post-mission summary of my death, and I took out a pen, my hands steady, and my heart calm. I wrote 3 words in a script that was entirely my own, a declaration of independence that would serve as the opening line for the rest of my life. Simulation terminated. Reality begins. I spent the next several hours in that booth, using the diner's patchy Wi-Fi to move through the digital shadows, setting up new identities for myself and Elena, ensuring we were both ghosts in a system that would never stop looking for us. I felt a strange kinship with the woman in Italy, 2 victims of the same master manipulator who were now the only ones capable of bringing his entire organization to its knees. We were the shadow wives, the women who knew where the bodies were buried because we had helped him dig the holes, and now we were the ones holding the shovels. I sent her a final encrypted message with a set of coordinates in a country that didn't have an extradition treaty with the United States, and I saw the delivered status blink on my screen like a tiny digital pulse of hope. As the sun began to rise over the city, casting a pale, cold light over the concrete jungle, I realized that I wasn't afraid of the future anymore, because the worst thing that could ever happen to me had already happened. I had been loved by a phantom, married to a machine, and marked for death by the man I trusted most, and I had come out on the other side with my mind intact and my soul on fire. I left the diner and walked toward a bus station, leaving my luxury SUV in the parking lot with the keys in the ignition, a gift for the first person who needed a fast way out of town. I was shedding my skin piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the Amanda Mark had built, leaving only the woman I was always meant to be before he found me. I boarded a bus heading west, sitting in the back row among the dreamers and the runaways, feeling the rhythmic vibration of the engine as a soothing lullaby for my new, uncertain existence. I looked out the window at the passing landscape, the suburban houses and manicured lawns looking like a dollhouse world that I had finally escaped, and I felt a quiet, fierce joy at the thought of the chaos I had left behind. Mark's Project Vulcan was crumbling, his assets were gone, and the Elena he had dreamed of was now my partner in the shadows, a twin flame of vengeance that would light the way for our next move. I was no longer a wife, a victim, or a variable. I was a ghost in the machine, and I was going to make sure the men who built it never slept soundly again. The journal lay in my lap, a heavy reminder of the cost of my freedom, but also a weapon of immense power that I would use to protect the next woman who found herself in a silver-embossed box with a blood-red ribbon. I knew there were more Marks out there, more men who viewed women as missions and lives as simulations, and I knew that I was now uniquely qualified to find them and shut them down. My 10-year anniversary hadn't been the end of my story, it was just the prologue, the long, painful education of a woman who was about to become the most dangerous auditor in the world. I closed my eyes and let the motion of the bus carry me toward the horizon, a digital ghost with an analog heart, finally free to write my own ending. The last thing I did before I drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep was to take the wedding ring off my finger, a diamond that was likely a blood diamond, paid for with the lives of people I would never know, and drop it into the bottom of my coffee cup. It sank to the bottom, a useless, glittering trinket in a sea of bitter dregs, a perfect metaphor for the decade I had spent in Mark's shadow. When I woke up, the sun was high in the sky and the bus was crossing the state line, and I knew that for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The silent anniversary was over, and the era of my voice had finally, gloriously begun. I didn't head for the state line. I headed for the one place Mark would never expect me to go, the headquarters of the very firm he claimed to consult for. Using the admin codes I'd pulled from the Lake Como server, I walked into the glass and steel lobby at 3 a.m., my vintage silk robe hidden under a trench coat, looking every bit the grieving widow he had planned for me to be. The security guards, recognizing the CEO's wife from the digital dossiers they'd been forced to memorize, bypassed the biometric locks for me, unknowingly ushering the fox directly into the center of the henhouse. I reached the mainframe room, the heart of their shadow operation, and felt the cold, artificial hum of the servers vibrating against my palms like the heartbeat of a beast I was about to slaughter. I plugged the journal's encrypted backup into the central hub, watching as the Project Vulcan files began to upload to every major news outlet, law enforcement agency, and human rights organization in the hemisphere. The screen glowed with the names of politicians, tech moguls, and hidden operatives who relied on Mark's ghost employees to do their dirty work, their secrets now hemorrhaging out into the public domain in a flood of digital fire. I watched the progress bar crawl toward 100%, feeling a sense of absolute clarity as I realized that by destroying Mark, I was taking down an entire ecosystem of predatory power. The alarms began to scream, a high-pitched wail that signaled the system's futile attempt to purge my intrusion, but I had already initiated a hardware lockout that would keep them out until the last byte was sent. As the final file uploaded, the glass doors behind me hissed open, and I turned to see the firm's head of security, a man Mark had described as a brother, standing there with a weapon drawn and a look of pure, cold professional detachment. He didn't ask what I was doing. He knew exactly what the flashing red lights on the server racks meant for his career and his freedom. But before he could pull the trigger, the monitors behind me erupted with a live news feed from 3 different continents, showing Mark's face and the Project Vulcan logo as the top headline of the century. The security chief hesitated, his loyalty to a paycheck suddenly outweighed by the realization that he was standing on a sinking ship, and I saw the moment his mission objective shifted from killing me to saving himself. I walked past him without a word, the power in the building flickering as the servers began to melt down under the weight of the burn protocol I had left behind as a parting gift. I stepped out into the pre-dawn air, just as the first sirens of the FBI and Interpol began to converge on the block, their blue and red lights painting the city in the colors of a justice that was 10 years overdue. I didn't wait to give a statement or be hailed as a hero. I simply faded into the crowd of early morning commuters, a woman who had just erased her past and set fire to the future of the men who tried to own her. I felt lighter than I had in a decade, the weight of the silver-embossed box and the blood-red ribbon finally replaced by the weightless freedom of being a ghost by choice, not by design. I found a small park nearby and sat on a bench, watching the sun rise over a world that was about to change forever because of a journal and a mistaken delivery. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a final automated message from the Lake Como server, confirming that Elena had safely reached the extraction point I had provided. We were the only 2 people who knew the full truth of what had happened inside that house, and as far as the world was concerned, we were both casualties of a corporate tragedy that had spiraled out of control. I took a deep breath of the cold, crisp air, the smell of ozone and jasmine finally replaced by the scent of dew-covered grass and the exhaust of a city waking up to a new reality. I reached into my bag and pulled out the physical journal, the leather now scuffed and the pages worn from the intensity of the night, and I realized that I no longer needed it as a shield or a weapon. I walked over to a trash can where a small maintenance fire was burning in a steel drum, and I watched the flames lick at the edges of the book that had been the script for my life. As the leather curled and the ink blackened, I felt the last of Mark's influence over me turn to ash, the simulations and variables dissolving into nothingness. The fire was bright and hungry, consuming the lies and the logic until there was nothing left but a glowing ember in the bottom of the bin. I stood there until the fire died down, a woman with no name, no husband, and no utilization period, finally standing on the solid ground of her own truth. The silent anniversary had ended not with a toast or a diamond, but with a roar of static and the absolute silence of a clean slate. I turned my back on the burning building and the chaos of the investigation, walking toward the subway station with the steady, purposeful stride of someone who finally knew exactly where they were going. The world would look for Amanda, and they would look for Elena, but they would never find the women who had died in that kitchen to make room for the survivors. I boarded the train, finding a seat near the window as we moved out of the city and toward the coast where the ocean would provide the perfect backdrop for my final disappearance. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass, seeing eyes that were no longer clouded by empathy simulations, or the need for a man's approval, but sharp and clear with the knowledge of my own strength. I was the one who had audited the ghost, and in doing so, I had discovered that the most powerful thing in any system is the person who refuses to be accounted for. The train hummed beneath me, a steady, rhythmic promise of a life that belonged entirely to me. As we reached the end of the line, I stepped onto the platform and felt the salt air on my face, the vastness of the sea mirroring the vastness of my own potential. I had enough money in my hidden accounts to live 1,000 lives, but for the first time, I only wanted the one I was currently standing in. I walked toward the water's edge, leaving my trench coat on the sand and walking into the surf, letting the cold water wash away the last traces of the Amanda Mark had loved. I emerged from the waves a stranger even to myself, a woman reborn in the wreckage of a billion-dollar lie. I didn't look back at the shore, and I didn't look back at the past. I just kept walking until the path was clear and the sun was high. The story of the shadow employee was over, but the story of the woman who burned him down was just beginning. I was no longer a variable in someone else's equation. I was the answer that no one saw coming. The silence was finally mine, and it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard.